Started. Thanks for coming out. We wanted to wait because there's a few more people we knew that said they were for sure coming who weren't here. But you are awesome. I think we're going to try to talk like roughly an hour, and that roughly we'll try to keep it down and then have time for questions and try not to bore you. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm going to be rude after that, so I'm going to have to cut out a little bit earlier.
That's okay. Anyone who needs to get
Just
out.
so you know, I'm not a total dick.
Thank you. Thank you for the heads up. It's really nice. Yeah, anyone feel fine about that. And also, we're trying to give minimal context as far as border history. I think some people are here. We did a presentation another time in Salt Lake, and there might have been a little heavy weight on the long-term border history. We're going to try to keep it pretty current and describe what's going on. And yet, again, we apologize if people already extensively know that. But we're going to try to give some context as to what we're resisting and what we're responding to in Arizona and also here in the United States and the world all over. We made a flyer that we didn't put out for this, that we wrote a title to Hasta un mundo sin fronteras, and we wrote Towards a World Without Borders. We take a firm and really strong abolitionist stance on borders and aren't interested in compromises or in any type of political solution amongst parties that has no solution whatsoever. And we want to make sure that that's stated from the get-go with our presentation. And we also wrote on there the local fight against global capitalism, because everything we're talking about is just a cog in the global capitalist machine that's happening right now, and the specific nature of it and the way it's evolving with the immigration battle here is really relevant to our lives here in Utah as in Arizona, and the border physically where we are is also really relevant to the way the border exists here and everywhere, and the way the borders exist beyond the idea of a physical border, right? Borders being divisions and privilege, border meaning gender privilege, border meaning different types of privilege with not only race but class, border meaning different sexual preferences having different privilege. Private property is a border. We take a pretty strict and strong abolitionist stance on all of those things, borders. So we're going to try to cruise through the PowerPoint because there's a lot here, and just briefly touch on a lot of what's there and maybe spend more time on the stuff that will be more relevant to today. But the first thing we want to just leave it with is the border is everywhere. It's not just this imaginary line that now has fences springing up across it, and the border industrial complex is also everywhere, and a lot of people are profiting off it in many places, including Utah, and a lot of people are being hurt by it, including here. So Matt can dive into the first part of the presentation.
So, by the way, I know that Ricky knows everybody in this town, but I don't. My name is Matt. I live and work with Ricky.
Hi, Matt.
Oh.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and a quick thing we'll say, I guess, too. We'll get to this at the end, who we work with and what we do, but just as a pseudo-presentation, or introduction, I should say, we, I guess, officially could say we're here from No More Deaths. It's a group in Arizona that we also volunteer with other organizations there. But call it a No More Deaths presentation, if you will.
So, like Ricky was saying, we wanted to start with a little bit of context and border history, but we're not going to go way into it like I guess people have in the past. And one sort of really important point that I want to make here is that I think that when people are describing border history and providing context for what's going on in the U.S. Southwest, people construct a lot of different narratives. And one narrative that's really, really dominant in sort of the human rights, humanitarian aid, social justice community in Arizona is starting in 1994. And 1994, for a number of reasons, is a really, really important year and sort of a sea change in the way that the border was enforced. And then there's other narratives that start in the early 1900s when the border sort of started first being enforced, or that start before that with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase that defined the U.S.-Mexican border where it is today. But I think it's really important to recognize that actually any coherent narrative of what's happening in the U.S. Southwest should start 500 years ago. Should start with the first imposition of borders on indigenous people by Spanish conquistadors. And that's not something that we have the time to go all the way into, but I do think it's important to recognize that the fight that Ricky was just describing against borders is one that's been happening for 500 years. And
Or longer.
Or longer, right? it's something that indigenous people have been dealing with for centuries. And like, I'm extremely, extremely new to this fight, and like, I'm coming from a really particular perspective, but there are people who have been doing this for 500 years or more. That being said, there are a couple of like more recent pieces of history that we want to touch on because they're like really important for understanding what's going on. And so I guess in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Mexico was investing an enormous amount in creating oil infrastructure with the hope of exporting oil. And then when the oil prices crashed in the early 1980s, they were saddled with an enormous amount of foreign debt, which left them open to being targeted by the IMF and the World Bank for economic neoliberal restructuring. And so what that resulted in is a financial collapse in Mexico. It resulted in essentially Mexico reforming its economy to remove protections for workers, for farmers, and removing land reform. That like sort of begun this process of people migrating first from rural communities into cities, and then eventually from cities towards the United States.
So one little thing too there were thousands of national industries that Presidente Madrid privatized. That was long before '94 NAFTA, that was in the mid-'80s, and that they finally reduced down to like 111 or something. I can't remember the exact figure, but thousands down to that. So just something tangible, a number.
Yeah, so the trends are like privatization and neoliberal restructuring. And then, of course, in 1994, NAFTA was implemented and sort of continued this and accelerated this, resulting in, again, like removing protections for small landowners, for workers, for campesinos, and people, again, are moving from rural areas to cities and then towards the United States. One really, really key thing to understand about that is in order for NAFTA to be passed, it was required that Mexico remove Article 27 from their constitution, which had guaranteed the constitutional right to ejidos, or the communally owned lands. And that was essentially the backbone of land reform in Mexico since the Mexican Revolution. So essentially, NAFTA was reversing 80 years of land reform, and again, pushing people off of their land. And this is one of the things that really contributed to like funneling people towards the United States in order to be able to feed their families. So that's one thing that was happening concurrently. Another thing that was happening at around the same time period is massive border militarization. And so essentially, prior to 1993, the strategy of then the INS and Border Patrol was that when people crossed the border without authorization, they would then attempt to apprehend those people and deport them. In 1993, the Border Patrol sector chief in El Paso unilaterally implemented a new strategy. And his strategy was to concentrate Border Patrol agents and infrastructure like lighting and surveillance equipment and fencing in urban areas. So essentially in El Paso, to prevent people crossing from Juarez. Because at the time, basically like the hotspots for people crossing without documentation were from Tijuana to San Diego, and then also from Juarez to El Paso, and that was where the vast majority of undocumented crossing was happening. When the strategy was implemented, it actually appeared to be, at least in terms of like preventing people from crossing in those areas, really, really successful. Like in a matter of months, like thousands and thousands of people who had been crossing on a daily basis dropped to just like a few people crossing through El Paso. And so that strategy was then implemented throughout the border. Beginning with, in 1994, the US government adopting the same strategy in San Diego with Operation Gatekeeper. And so essentially it was employing the same strategy, concentrating Border Patrol agents on the physical border, like within eyesight of each other, using high-intensity lighting, using surveillance equipment, and using fencing to prevent people from crossing in urban areas. And this strategy eventually was extended to Arizona and to Texas, as you can see. But the consequence of this wasn't that people stopped crossing the border. The consequence of this was that people moved out of the cities and people started crossing in deserts and people started crossing in mountains. And so this strategy was called prevention through deterrence. And essentially, it says up here that it would elevate the risk of apprehension, and that's part of it, but another really, really important part of it, an explicit part of the strategy, is to increase the risk and the cost associated with crossing the border without documentation. So the explicit intent of this policy was to make it more expensive to cross the border and to make it more dangerous. And that happened. Immediately after Operation Gatekeeper, the price of paying a coyote to take you across the border in San Diego skyrocketed. And immediately after the strategy was implemented throughout the border, the number of people who experienced poor conditions and who died crossing the border also skyrocketed